All right, it looks like we're on air. So, Professor Arbour, thanks for being willing to come on and have a conversation with me. So,
Thanks.
just to jump right in, all right, did you want to say something?
Not at all. I'm not a professor anywhere. I teach adjunctly at Weatherford College, but I have not taught a class there in a couple of years. My work situation has prevented me from being able to do that, but probably this fall I'll get back over there.
Cool. So, just to jump right in, I am an atheist, by which I mean I don't believe there are any reasons to indicate the existence of a God. And would you mind telling me some of the reasons you believe there are for belief in a God? Then I'd like to tell you my position on those reasons. Then I'd just like to hear your thoughts on my position.
Sure. So, um, I mean, there's lots of places to dive in, but I would say there's Anselm's ontological argument, the modal ontological argument, Cartesian ontological arguments, the argument from motion, the argument from numbers, the teleological argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, the moral argument, the argument from so many arguments, arguments from religious experience. I think there are lots and lots of good reasons to believe in God. The one that I've been doing a lot of thinking about lately is the modal ontological argument. So I maybe that's a place we could have a conversation.
Sure, that sounds great. So, my position on what did you say something?
Well, maybe before we talk about that, you identify yourself as an atheist, and then you define that by saying you think that there are no good arguments for the existence of God. There are a great many people who believe in God and who don't believe that there are any good arguments for the existence of God. So your definition of atheism seems perfectly compatible with people believing that there is a God. They just doubt the projects that are built on natural theology. That seems kind of like a weird definition of atheism.
Oh, sure. It's kind of like methodological naturalism as opposed to metaphysical naturalism. You can be a methodological naturalist and still be a theist, whereas you adopt the position of naturalism purely for the purposes of science. And so I'm using it for more of that perspective because I'm more interested in the epistemic side of is there really a reason as opposed to the ontological side of whether or not it actually exists. Because I think we can't really answer the ontological question. It's really more about do we have good reasons or not, which I think most modern atheists identify with that.
Oh, so you're an agnostic then. You're saying we can't know about the ontology of the thing.
Right. My position is definitely compatible with agnosticism, but most self-defining atheists usually adopt the lack of a belief definition due to the new atheists popularizing it. And since they're my target audience, I usually go
something that people in the philosophical community do. The new atheists do that because they're not up on what's going on in academic philosophy. But so the academic atheists who I really think are very good thinkers, people like Paul Draper, Evan Fales, Graham Oppie, Eric Wielenberg, Michael Tooley, Stephen Meitzen, John Schellenberg, none of them would adopt that definition of atheism. And that I just think that that's what you're outlining is perfectly compatible with agnosticism, just to say that we can't know whether or not there are gods or a God. I think that's an interesting position, but it's not the same thing as saying there is no God. And, you know, even as we discussed earlier this week on the phone, there's a long history about the use of atheos. But in the contemporary academic scene, atheist is not defined as the lack of a belief in God. It is defined as an ontological position that there are no gods. So it is a claim about metaphysical naturalism. And if we're going to have an academic discussion about the contemporary philosophical scene as it concerns these kinds of arguments, it doesn't make sense to do that unless we can first get clear on what is and is not being claimed.
Right. That's why I present the word I use I'll label my definition. Then I present the definition itself. So to clear up that ambiguity. But yeah, I definitely use the definition, the term atheism, because it is what most modern atheists in the popular community identify with, and since they're my target audience and the people who my group, my demographic, so I'm going to use the language they use because in language is ambiguous. It can mean whatever you want, and usage wins out. And right now, the most popular usage for self-defining atheist is the lack of belief terminology. So even though it may not be used in philosophy, it is used in popular culture more often, and so I tend to identify with that kind of definition, kind of like how the word gay wasn't originally use for the LGBT community, but they adopted it and it just became synonymous with
Sure.
their group.
Yeah, there's no question in my mind that language is elastic, and that usage determines meaning, at least sometimes. But there are larger debates in philosophy of language as to how that works and whether or not you can misuse words. Because if words can really just mean anything, as you say, then if I say the sky is black and you say, no, it's not, I say, well, words just mean what I intend them to mean. And sure it is. So I don't think that's the most helpful way to approach issues in philosophy of language. Nonetheless, as long as we are going to just define our terms carefully so that we're not ships passing in the night and failing to talk to each other, I guess that's fine. I am interested in the ontological questions of whether or not there is a God. I am also interested in the epistemic questions of whether or not we could know whether or not there is a God. Now, if I heard you correctly a minute ago, you don't think that we can know whether or not there is a God. So that's the ontological issue. And you think maybe there's an epistemic veil that we can't get through. So you're instead interested in whether or not there are any good reasons to maybe believe that there are gods, but you're wanting to focus on the epistemology and not on the ontology. Is that correct?
Yes, because my position is that I'm an atheist to the fact that there are no reasons. So I'm going to try to adopt the burden of proof that I can demonstrate that there are no reasons that indicate the existence of God. I'm going to try and show that any of the arguments that you present, I can show will not work, or I can undercut them in some way to show that they do not, in fact, indicate the existence of a God.
Okay.
But to go a little further, another reason I adopt the label atheist is because I do think that we can refute the idea of certain kinds of gods, like all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, and there are good reasons to believe that that kind of a God definitely does not exist. So I would say I'm an atheist towards the Christian kind of a God, or the Abrahamic kind of a God, even if I can't show that all kinds of gods don't exist, because there are certain kinds of gods that don't have the same kinds of logical contradictions, and like a deistic kind of a God maybe, or the Greek or Norse kinds of gods, maybe those could exist, and I don't have good arguments against those as being self-refuting or having self-contradictory properties. So,
Okay.
so I would just be an atheist towards the Christian God, as an agnostic towards just any kind of God in general.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that distinction. It's interesting to me that you single out like the Christian God or the Abrahamic God instead of saying like I don't believe in the Islamic God or the Abrahamic God. Is there a reason that you like in particular single out Christianity there?
It's just mostly the people who I talk to happen to be Christians, purely cultural thing.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. So related to that, I want to, I guess, stipulate, I am a Christian. I'm one of those people who believes that God is all powerful, all knowing. I believe that God sent his son, Jesus, to live a life that was totally perfect and without sin. I believe that he was crucified. I believe 3 days later he was raised from the dead. Not just this is some cute story that we tell. Like I really think it happened in history. And I think that his death on the cross and the shedding of his blood is important for the forgiveness of sins. I don't think that we can be forgiven without that. So I identify with that particular Christian tradition. And I'm fairly ecumenical about the way that I know there are some Christians who they kind of there's something like a no true Scotsman fallacy. Like you have to believe this, and there's like 100 gazillion trillion things you have to check the box on, otherwise it doesn't count. I'm much more comfortable just saying like Nicene orthodoxy. If you can confess the creed with integrity, like that's the kind of Christianity that I'm interested in defending. Although I certainly have beliefs about a lot of secondary and tertiary issues that I think are important. I just don't think they're important to defining what Christianity is. Now, I share all that only to stipulate that many of the arguments for the existence of God that I think are rational, they don't get you Christianity. They don't get you even the Christian God necessarily. They get you a supernatural being. And it is a mistake, on my view, to say, well, the Kalam cosmological argument doesn't get you Jesus, therefore it's a bad argument. Well, that's not what the Kalam argument is trying to do. So that's where I want to make a distinction between natural theology, which proceeds by way of general revelation and just philosophical analysis, and dogmatic theology that would be driven by special revelation or investigation of the Christian scriptures or things like that. I think both of those things are super important, and I don't want to discount one or the other. I just want to stipulate, at least in the conversation that we're going to have today, I'm not intending, not that I won't appeal to scripture in a couple of places maybe, but I don't understand our conversation to be one primarily about biblical theology as much as about philosophical theology. Is that?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Perfectly clear. So essentially, to use an example, the cosmological arguments, my response against them is going to be that there could be an answer. I agree there has to be some necessary thing to act as the ground of all contingent things, but that necessary thing doesn't need to be a being. It can be a necessary, eternal, all-powerful, natural thing. And so that would essentially undercut that the cosmological argument indicates any kind of a God. And essentially that's going to be the argument I'm going to take, is that we can appeal to a necessary natural thing, which is not conscious, and thereby showing the arguments, if they work equally for this natural thing that isn't conscious as they do for a God, then the arguments don't in fact indicate a God.
Okay, there was a lot there, so I'm trying to process it. When you say like a completely eternal, necessary, natural thing, like what, can you help me understand how you're defining natural and like presumably against supernatural? Like what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a natural thing or a supernatural thing?
No idea. I have no idea of a philosophically sound definition or distinction between the natural and the supernatural. It's just kind of a general category I use to lack of a better term kind of a thing.
I didn't know if that was a technical term that you were introducing. So I'm not sure that I have those categories worked out in my mind either. So maybe it's something we can do together. So yeah, there's lots of different versions of various cosmological arguments, but the Kalam cosmological argument proceeds as follows. The first premise: everything that begins to exist is caused to begin to exist. The second premise is that the universe began to exist. And then from that, we can conclude, just by way of a simple modus ponens operation, that the universe was caused to begin to exist. Now then we just need to ask ourselves, what is that cause? And if I understand what you're saying, you're on board with the idea that whatever that cause is has to be something that exists of necessity. Okay, I'm on board there. And there are arguments that would support the idea that it couldn't be something that is unconscious. It would have to be something that has a will, and whatever that thing is exercises its will to bring about whatever the cause of the creation of the universe is. Because if it wasn't a conscious being, or then whatever the necessary and sufficient conditions that would have obtained to generate the creation of the universe would have happened long before the universe actually came into existence. So the idea is this: when you have all of the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to obtain, then that thing obtains. So imagine that I have like oxygen, and I have gasoline, and then I have fire. Like, you bring all those things together and necessarily you get an explosion, right? It's not possible that all three of those things exist at the same time, given that the laws of nature are what they are in our universe, and you don't get fire. It's not possible. You're going to get an explosion. So if whatever the necessary and sufficient conditions were prior to the creation of the universe had always existed as some necessary thing that was unconscious, then there's no exercise of a will that brings about the creation of the universe, right? Then it would have happened and the universe would be infinitely old. But we know from science that the universe began to exist. This is well documented. I mean, the easiest thing to point to is the idea of red light shift, that the Hubble telescope helped us figure out that the universe is actually expanding. It's getting bigger. And I'm not a cosmologist, so I don't know all the ramifications of this, but it's pretty fascinating. I don't know if you saw the pictures of the black hole that got released earlier today. I think I'm the only person who's really nervous that it looks a little bit like the Eye of Sauron. So the kinds of discoveries that we're able to make scientifically that show that the universe is expanding lead us to believe that at some point the universe was just a little tiny prick and there was a Big Bang. And that's when the universe began to exist. And the models of oscillating universes that are expanding and contracting that are thought to invalidate this violate everything that we know about physics. They violate laws of thermodynamics, they violate the law of entropy, and they violate the idea that an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. But if we're stipulating that the universe is expanding and the only stuff that exists is inside the universe, then there's nothing on the other side of the universe to exercise from outside of it. So it seems like the universe began to exist, the universe was caused to begin to exist, and whatever the necessary and sufficient conditions were must have involved the exercise of a will, a decision to create. Because if it didn't, then the universe would have always existed and been eternal. But we know that that's not the case from science. We also have mathematical and philosophical reasons to think that the universe could not be eternal. So again, the being on the other side of that I think this gets you is a necessary being who's conscious. Whatever being is responsible for the creation of the universe must also be extremely powerful. Whether...
Well, let me interrupt you just there to respond to that point that you've already made so far. So in physics, there are certain physics theories like Nima Arkani-Hammad, who theorizes that there's something, that time and space are emergent properties from some more fundamental physical thing. And Sean Carroll is also working on this emergent space-time kind of thing. So we can have a universe that time and space and matter all began to exist at the Big Bang, but they come from more natural fundamental properties, which are spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. So we don't actually need a timeless being in that.
So what are those things that are timeless and spaceless and immaterial?
It has to do with the quantum states. It doesn't have like a label. It's kind of like dark energy or dark matter. It's just a thing there.
And we can observe those things?
No, we can't observe those things. They're hypothetical.
Okay, so it's not an empirical discipline that we're doing here. This is theoretical physics. It's not the same thing as empirical disciplines like biology, chemistry, or normal physics.
Correct. It can't be observed just like a God can't be observed, but it can answer the same problems of how did the universe come into existence.
Very good. So this theoretical physics stuff that you're talking about runs into the same unobservable phenomena that God. So they're basically on the same footing, on your view.
Well, the position that I'm presenting, it would be on the same footing. So I'm presenting a position called naturalistic pantheism, which you can find in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's just a definition of something equivalent to what just natural stuff, naturalism. It's just kind of naturalism. And so I'm saying that this thing can have certain properties just like a God has, the godlike properties of necessary, all-powerful, eternal. And so it can solve all of the problems that God can solve without the consciousness. So to answer what your second point was about you need a consciousness to cause this action to happen, otherwise it would have been there for eternity. Well, that only applies to the A theory of time, and there can be iterative versions of time, or like the B theory of time. Like, for example, you can pick a number. Just pick any number, 47. Like, there are infinitely many numbers before and after 47, but you picked 47. And so there could be a natural law or a natural process that has the same kind of iterative process, like a quantum state, that just picks a number and says, we're going to start the universe here. So that isn't actually a problem for the natural universe. We can solve that just like a God could solve that, where he has some kind of reason or something, part of his nature, which causes him to create a universe at a particular time. Well, we can say that there is also a part of the nature of naturalistic pantheism, some kind of quantum state or law of its nature, which causes it to create a universe at a particular time.
So let's dive in here on the metaphysics of time. This is something that could be interesting, right? You're introducing these distinctions between a-theoretic and b-theoretic approaches. So there are two vastly different debates that are going on in philosophy of time that are deeply related to issues in physics. One has to do with the ontology of when things exist. The other question has to do with whether or not there is an objective present. And how we cash out those things is going to be very important in terms of how we understand the universe. So help me understand. I mean, there's at least 3 different positions that you could take on an A theoretic approach, and at least 2 different positions that you could take on a B theoretic approach. And then there's a hybrid view that I would want to discuss here in just a minute. But let me know, what is your understanding of the metaphysics of time? And I'll try to make the same argument in a way that's perfectly consistent with the way that you understand time.
So I don't consider time and space to be metaphysical first principles of reality. I can say they could be emergent properties from something more fundamental. So they're not metaphysical, they're just emergent properties. And so my view of time is that, like, there are theories of multiple kinds of time. You don't need just a single kind of time that permeates the universe. Space and time are inextricably linked. So you can't get time independently of space. They're just the same physical thing. And so in the physics view of time is very different from the philosophical metaphysics view of time.
Right, but I'm playing in both playgrounds right now. I'm happy to discuss the physics. I'm also happy to discuss the metaphysics. And the metaphysics is the even more fundamental. So it doesn't make sense to talk about the architecture of a house without talking about the cement foundation or the pier and beam foundation, however you're going to do that. And I'm worried that what we're doing right now is a lot of physics without the underlying metaphysics, which is going to ultimately be nonsensical. So let's make sure that we're getting clear here. I'm fine with you're outlining a view of 4-dimensionalism, which is one of the B theoretic approaches, that time and space are inseparably linked. But how does adopting a B theoretic approach where moments simply reduce to either before then or after then or simultaneous to relations, how does adopting that view help you out of the problem that the universe began to exist?
It didn't. I'm granting the universe began to exist. It's not a problem for either the B or A theory of time. Like, I can grant either one and say that there is some natural iterative process within nature that causes it to pick a number, just any random number, like a quantum state, where it says 47. And so it starts the universe at 47 just because of the quantum state. Even though there's infinitely many points of time before that, it doesn't matter to the quantum state. The quantum state just picks the 47, just kind of like a god can pick start the universe at this point in time.
Yeah, so if the view then is to play on the analogy that the universe began to exist at 47, then 47 is 0, right? But the whole point of 47 is that it is not 47. There are at least 46 integers that precede it. So if you think that the universe began to exist, then it cannot begin to exist at some arbitrary point of time, 47. When it began to exist, that's T0. That's what beginning means.
Remember, there's multiple kinds of time here. So we can have time in our universe that was created at the Big Bang. And then there's a subset of time, another kind of time, a different dimension of time. And that time has an infinite amount of time in between it. And so on this spectrum, we can just say that the quantum state picked this time along the
This is a lot of science of the gaps stuff. Like, I don't think we have any good reasons for believing these views that you have about alternative times. We have no phenomenological evidence of it. And we definitely don't have any empirical evidence of it. So you're postulating a lot of things that might work, but you're having to do a lot more work. There's a lot more baked into the ontology of what you're saying is responsible for the creation of the universe than a simple God. So if we want to appeal to something like Occam's razor, it sure seems like the inference to the best explanation would be something other than crazy models of theoretical physics that cannot be tested.
Right, so I would agree with you on that point. We don't have a way to test this, just like we don't have a way to test a God. So we're on equal footing on that point. The one step up that physics has is that all of these physical theories are combinations of principles, particles, and laws that have been verified in the field of physics. So they're just different combinations of these Lego pieces to build different models of what reality might be like based on these things.
No, they haven't been confirmed in physics. They've been
just to clarify.
Theoretical physics, which is a different field, right? These things cannot be tested. They cannot be verified.
Just to clarify, in theoretical physics, the only things they're allowed to use in theoretical physics are principles, particles, and laws that have already been verified. And they're combining them in different ways to make different models of the world. And these new combinations haven't been verified to make new predictions. And there's lots of different ways to combine these things that we already know. But all of the stuff in theoretical physics is principles, particles, and laws. They're grounded in principles, particles, and laws that have been verified. So even if the combinations haven't, the fundamental parts have. So like they use the equations of Einstein's general special relativity, Bohm, de Broglie-Bohm theory, Feynman's diagrams, the Feynman equations.
The Bohm theory, I mean, and how we've got at least 9 different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Bohm is one of them.
No, I'm talking about his general work, the work he's done, the equations that he has verified, all of those things, all of those big equations that have made testable predictions have been verified, and they're now Lego pieces that the physicists can play with and build in different ways. So all the fundamental parts have been verified.
Okay.
But then to go on to your next point, even if, like, I agree that neither the physics nor a God can be demonstrated, but from my perspective, it seems the physics is significantly simpler than an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being. Because if you take all of this physics that we're positing, and you take a God and you compare the two, well, the God can create the physics, can create infinitely many universes of all of these kinds of physical things. So the God must necessarily be infinitely more complicated than the physics stuff, no matter how more complicated we kind of assert all these things.
No, I don't. So I reject that argument altogether. On my view, God is metaphysically simple. There are no parts. There are no divisions. It's just there's just the one thing, the one substance. On your view, you've got multiple things that are underlying this. So from the standpoint of simplicity, classical theism offers something that your analysis of what that God must be like is incompatible with what the Abrahamic faiths all confessed God to be, up until, well, we'll say things started falling apart in the early 1900s, and you have lots of competing views on God might not be simple, God might be complex, but we don't need to go into that. And those views had been around since before the 1900s. I'm not trying to say that no one ever thought that, but they didn't become popularized or normalized until the 20th century. Certainly not.
I pick up on that, the simplicity thing.
Yeah.
So my view is, I can say, if you want to say that there is this divine simplicity, aseity, I think, I can just say the same thing.
Things, right?
Yeah.
Aseity and simplicity are not the same thing.
Right. So I can take
both.
So I can take the divine simplicity, which I consider to be arbitrary. I don't think it makes any sense. I think it's the exact opposite of simplicity to call God simple. But if you want to think that is correct, then I can take the same thing and say that, well, naturalistic pantheism is perfectly simple. And all of this stuff that follows, these are just properties of the perfect simplicity of naturalistic pantheism. So I have the perfect simplicity as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll need to think a little bit more about that. Yeah. I want to come back and register just a point of agreement with you on something. I don't think that space-time is emergent the way that you do, but neither do I think that time is one of the metaphysical foundations of everything. On my view, time is contingent. So whatever view of time there is, right, we've got at least 3 different A-theoretic approaches and a couple of different B-theoretic approaches. And then moving spotlight theory, which is kind of the theory I'm currently attracted to, which is B-theoretic about the ontology and A-theoretic about tense, which accounts for the phenomena that we all experience of experiencing at present, a now that seems real, that whatever the view of time is, I think it could have been different. Now that contingency cries out for explanation, right? If it's contingent, then what is it contingent upon? In my view, and this is not original to me at all, the 4 fundamental aspects of any systematic metaphysics are going to be somebody's account of the metaphysics of modality, somebody's account of causation, someone's account of properties, and why can I not remember the 4th right now? It'll come to me in just a second. Properties, causation, modality, and the laws of nature. That would be the fourth. Okay. So once you have those four things in place, then a lot of things are going to follow from that. For instance, whether you believe in determinism or indeterminism. And then based on that, you might come up with a theory of free will, whether you think we have the ability to do otherwise or whether you don't think we have the ability to do otherwise. And then from there, you're going to be able to come up with theories of moral responsibility. Do we need the ability to do otherwise in order to be held morally responsible, or do we not? Or is there no such thing as moral responsibility? So those things, as I see it, are all downstream of these kind of fundamental things. And I think the same is true of time. I don't think time should be included in the most fundamental aspects of how you would go about constructing a universe. Now, these accounts, these big four, D.M. Armstrong defends this, and numerous other systematic metaphysicians as well, most of whom, at least Armstrong, he is not a theist, right? So I'm not trying to smuggle theism in under the radar in some way and then get it out. But my understanding of modality is going to shape the way that I think about time, and it's also going to shape what I think about God. So maybe you've got a response that offers I'm not saying that it is as simple as God, but if you're naturalistic pantheism, it has some simple being operating in the background who's not a conscious being. Maybe that could account. I'm dubious. It's not clear to me that eliminates the possibility of God's existence, right? Am I missing something there?
Well, not necessarily. Like the fact that if a God exists, there could always be a greater God that created it. So even if God existed, that wouldn't eliminate the possibility of other gods. So I'm essentially just saying there is a necessary thing that exists in all possible worlds, the maximally great thing. It's just not a being. And so it would be a competing hypothesis with the God hypothesis, where I'm asserting it as a competing hypothesis. And so if there was one of these things, there wouldn't be the other. So
okay.
It's maximally great in that sense.
Right. So, but these are both possible explanations that could account for the existence of the universe. On the one hand, we've got right. So on the one hand, you have the possibility of naturalistic pantheism, and on the other hand, you have the possibility of God. Right.
Right.
And you would say both of those are possible, right?
Right.
Okay. So possibly God exists, right?
Yes.
All right. Then God exists.
So going into the ontological argument.
Yeah. Exactly. The modal, in particular, the modal ontological argument. So this is not a Cartesian ontological argument, nor is it an Anselmian ontological argument. Discussing uniquely, I mean, do you object to S5 modal logic? Because we can get successful ontological arguments on lesser systems if we need to.
No, I think that the ontological arguments are a category error between imaginary properties that, as opposed to existing properties. So, but just to touch on one thing you said earlier, like the four things you said that are fundamental to reality: the modality, laws of nature, properties, and what was the other one?
Causation.
Causation. My position is kind of like Kant's noumena phenomena distinction. I think those are all noumenal properties, and we can't know anything about the noumenal. I think there are infinitely many ways those can be. We don't know which is right, and we have to take a phenomenal approach, more like following the physics kind of thing. This is what we can demonstrate so far as we know, but that's where we have to stop. So I think there are lots of ways it could be, and we don't know which is right. But we can posit that any way that you can come up with, I can essentially come up with an alternative, subtract the consciousness, and get the same result kind of thing. That's essentially my approach to the argument.
Why do you think that we can't know anything about the noumenal realm?
I would say because of the biggest problems in physics and philosophy and science that have pretty much shown that we can't justify those kinds of noumenal claims, like the problem of induction, the problem of universals, Agrippa's trilemma, the problem of the criterion, all kinds of big problems in every field of knowledge that show that we just don't have any way to get to that kind of justification.
Okay, I'm not sure that I'm familiar with all of the things that you just mentioned, but what's what's wrong with the problem of induction? Why be a skeptic about induction? Because it seems like if we're going to do that, then we've just undercut all scientific claims also, because you have the problem of induction in science.
Well, it's only a problem if you're making metaphysical claims about what reality is really like. If I'm only making apparent claims about what I can demonstrate, well, then it's not a problem. So, for example, like the noumenal phenomena distinction. It's a problem if you're trying to make a noumenal claim about what reality is really like. It's not a problem if you're trying to make a distinction about what reality appears to be like, as so far as you can tell.
But it would be a problem if you were wanting to quantify over predictions about the future, right? Like, just because I drop the pencil 10 times and it falls to the floor 10 times, the problem of induction is going to say, I can't know what will happen in the future. I can guess, right? And it might be rational, but you couldn't say that science tells us that when I drop this pencil 5 minutes from now, it will drop, because that's the problem of induction. So if you want to bite that bullet, like, okay, that's not a bullet that I want to bite. I want to say, no, we probably can know things about what would happen in the future, assuming that the laws of nature remain constant and there's no intervention or miraculous involvement or something like that. But on your view of the problem of induction, you wouldn't be able to make those kind of claims, would you?
Well, right. So my solution is, like, if I say I am holding this bottle of water and this is a real bottle of water, I can't justify that claim because we could be in the matrix. This bottle of water may just be a bunch of ones and zeros. It doesn't exist.
Okay.
However, if I make the claim I am apparently holding a bottle of water, that is tautologically true. It doesn't make a difference. Even if I'm in the matrix, it still appears to me I'm holding a
You're
bottle
just
of water.
saying it's incorrigible at that point. Okay.
Correct. So if I use that self-referential kind of a system, I say the model of science, the methodology of science gives us this picture of reality. It's like saying, to science, it appears that this. Just like it says, to me, it appears
That's
that
the way
this.
the operator works. Is you're saying, like, scientifically, there's the claim itself is in parentheses, and then right before then we have this.
To science, it appears like.
Okay. All right.
So it's more like the phenomenology or instrumentalism.
You're not making any claims about truth here. You're just making claims about. So you're a skeptic all the way down about whether or not we can know anything true about science, but whether science actually. So are you an instrumentalist then? Because it's not, or are you an anti-realist?
No, I would be
not a scientific realist. That's very clear.
Correct. I would be more of like an instrumentalist or a phenomenalist. I would not say that it is realism, but I wouldn't be anti-realist. I wouldn't say it's not real. I'd say it could be either one. We just can't justify one way or the other. So I kind of.
That's interesting, because it's another point of agreement. I'm an instrumentalist as well. I'm dubious about whether science can really get at the truth, but not for the same reasons that you are. But that's interesting. Okay. So yeah, let's talk about modal ontological arguments. Where do you find that the argument, and let's just think about it in terms of the logic, where is it logically invalid? Let's figure out whether it's valid or not, and then we will ask whether or not it's sound.
So yeah, I essentially agree that it's valid, that the conclusion follows from the premises, but I think the premises are unsound.
Oh, well, you just told me a minute ago you think possibly God exists. So that's the only premise in the argument. That's the only premise of the argument. So if you concede that, then the rest of it falls.
I'm thinking of Plantinga's version, which has like 7 premises.
No. So Plantinga's version was first published in a book called The Nature of Necessity, Oxford University Press, I think 1977. Could be 79. Not certain. And he covers all this in chapter 10, and it's built on a whole approach to modal metaphysics that I largely agree with. And his views on modal metaphysics are not unique to theism. There are lots of atheists or agnostics who think that his way of thinking about the nature of possibility and the nature of necessity are the right ways to think about this. So just for your viewers at home who might not be up on modal metaphysics, this is a way of trying to make sense out of apparent contingencies in the universe, and just ways of saying, last night I had spaghetti for dinner, but I could have just as easily not eaten spaghetti and eaten a salad instead. So this does not seem to be, like, my eating of the spaghetti does not seem to be something that's necessary or determined. Presumably it could have been different. Or like the existence of the universe itself, right? most people deny that the existence of the universe is necessary. They think it's contingent. There could have been nothing at all. And so we have to ask these questions. Why is there something rather than nothing, right? Now, the way that metaphysics kind of recovered from some of the hardcore skepticism that you're still thinking about, because Kant definitely shaped things for a long, long time. And he wrote a lot about, metaphysics, or why we shouldn't do metaphysics because of these things. And that ultimately led to a division between continental philosophy and analytic philosophy. But the early analytics this is roughly the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, all kind of thought metaphysics was dumb. Like it's really not worth doing because you can't know anything.
Like A.J. Ayer and the positivists.
Yeah, all of the positivists, not just them, Bertrand Russell, and a number of them that ended up dying out because of the work of people like Quine, Plantinga, Boswell Mitchell, Bill Alston, and others. Because now we just recognize that a lot of the arguments for things like logical positivism were self-referentially incoherent. There's no good reasons for thinking that they're right. The same thing about scientism, right? So I don't think you fall into this category because you're an instrumentalist and not a realist, but people who are realist about science and they think that science can just prove everything. Well, science can't prove the claim that science can prove everything. So there's at least one thing that science can't prove. So it doesn't really make sense to adopt that posture. But in the 50s, we saw this turn. This is the 1950s. We saw this pretty significant turn towards a revival of interest in analytic metaphysics. So this is not the continental stuff where everybody is just talking past each other and nobody ever tries to get clear. This is in the analytic tradition where we really value, let's be as precise as we possibly can with our terminology so that we're defining exactly what we are and are not talking about. And we want to use logic as rigorously as we possibly can. So my view of this, the two most important things that happened in the 20th century, philosophically speaking, were we have a metaphysics of modality and we have a semantics that allows us to talk about it. So you have this development not only in modal metaphysics, but also in philosophy of language. And those are probably the two most important things that happened in philosophy in the 20th century, at least from where I sit. That's the way I see it. Now, one of the ways that Plantinga and others taught us to think about the nature of possibility is by thinking about possible worlds. This is a philosophical term that does not mean the same thing that a lot of our popular culture would interpret it to mean. So there was a TV show on in the 90s where there was a group of people and they basically hopped from parallel universe to parallel universe. That is not the right way to think about what possible worlds are, right? Or multiverse theory. That is not necessarily the right way to think about possible worlds, because they can all be subsumed under just one, like all of the different universes in a multiverse are still just kind of one world. So
like a cosmos, Carl Sagan's cosmos.
Yeah. So a possible world is a maximally consistent state of affairs. And we could draw out a giant truth table because every proposition exists in every possible world, and it's either going to be true or false in that possible world. And that's how we can differentiate between different possible worlds, because there's going to be at least one difference between each possible world. And there's a potentially infinite number of these possible worlds. So they go on and on. But and there are these things that I don't think exist, impossible worlds, right? Where there are logical contradictions. And if you are somebody like me who thinks that the law of non-contradiction is true, then you can't have contradictions. So those worlds could not exist. But there are these other worlds that could exist, right? They're possible. And then there are different metaphysical views as to whether or not those worlds do exist or not, right? So David Lewis, who was one of the most important metaphysicians, he was also an atheist. He believed that all the possible worlds like actually were real,
Modal realism,
not just as idea. Well, so no, modal realism or modal concretism. His view is modal concretism. He thinks that all of the actual worlds. So I'm a modal realist. I think that the possible worlds exist as possibilities, but they're not. I only want to make a claim about the actual world, that the actual world is real. The other worlds, I don't know if they're real or not. I kind of tend to think that they're probably not.
to my understanding, modal realism was the position that all the possible worlds actually exist. I thought that was modal realism.
No, that's modal concretism. Modal realism is the alternative view, the Plantingian view. But you're a realist about the possibilities, but you're not saying that they actually exist. So and these terms, it gets really confusing because here we are talking about the actual world, right? Well, the term actual is an indexical if you're a modal concretist, because the actual world is just relative to whatever world you're in. So you jump over to the other world and then that's the actual world, right? Whereas if you're a modal realist like me and you're talking about the actual world, you're saying the one that actually exists, and I don't think that the other worlds exist as concrete things. I think they exist as possibilities. I think this is the right way to think about possibility, because of the way that the law of non-contradiction works. So it seems to me that there's a possible world where you and I never had this conversation, right? It looks just like this world up to and including the moment where you emailed me. But that didn't happen. So we never have this conversation. I don't see anything that seems like a logical contradiction about that state of affairs. So it seems right that we would say that's a possible state of affairs. It's just not the actual state of affairs. So with that understanding of the metaphysics of modality, then we just need to talk about accessibility relations between the worlds, right? So do you exist in any of those other worlds? Well, clearly you do. I mean, we were just talking about one of these where you and I both exist, but we never have this conversation. But your existence in those worlds isn't the same as your existence here in this world, because this is the actual world. So you exist as a concrete particular here. Whereas in those other worlds, they haven't been instantiated. So because they're not instantiated or actualized, you don't exist as a concrete particular in those worlds. So yeah, I think that's the right way to think about these sorts of things. Is there any objection on your part to approaching the metaphysics of modality from that standpoint?
No, absolutely not. Not with what you said so far. I would just like to jump straight into the ontological argument and say my objection would be that maximal and greatness are made up properties. They aren't actually properties of the universe. Like energy, matter, spin, motion, those are actual properties of things existing in the universe, whereas opposed to maximal and greatness, I consider to be imaginary. They're not actual real properties. Kind of like I like something, or Klingons. Klingon isn't an actual property of something in the universe, or tribbles. They're just made up. So I would consider maximal and greatness to be imaginary properties that are not legitimate object of reference for first order quantification. So, and we can show this by saying, just picking a different definition of maximal or greatness. Like there's the Douglas Gaskin made the argument that, well, maybe the greatest of all possible being is one that can create something with the least amount of power. Therefore, the greatest being is one that can create the universe without existing. Therefore, God does not exist. Now, of course, this isn't actually an argument that there is an existing God that doesn't exist. It's just pointing out a reductio ad absurdum, that if you want to accept these definitions or these quantifiers,
the argument itself is a reductio ad absurdum because it's a contradiction.
Well, the contradiction is irrelevant to the argument. The argument is just about the definitions. You can pick a definition of maximal and greatness, which is different from the definition that you're using, to get a reductio to some absurdity.
So you're separating these terms, and they're not separate. There's not maximal and greatness. It's one term, maximal greatness.
Okay, so, I'm happy to grant that.
Okay. So you don't think that our intuitions can guide us here at all?
Absolutely not. I tend to go with something like Plantinga's natural argument against evolution, or evolutionary argument against naturalism, and say that our intuitions are only a description of what is survivability and what has helped us survive. It tells us nothing about truth at all. We cannot use intuitions to guide us towards truth. It's just a survivable metric. And I look to history and say that people use our intuitions to think that lightning was created by Zeus. People use our intuitions to think that fairy circles were created by fairies. We use our intuition to think that objects are solid. 99% of objects is empty space. Our intuitions are not in any sense indicative of truth at all. They're just indicative of survivability.
So you think that the evolutionary argument against naturalism is successful?
In some cases, yes. I think that the way Plantinga uses it, he confuses methodological and metaphysical naturalism. But I think if you use it against the metaphysical naturalism, yes, it's successful.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not a metaphysical naturalist.
No, I'm not. Because again, my position is the Kant's noumenal phenomenal distinction. We can't know anything about the noumenal, and the noumenal is the metaphysics. So we're just completely isolated from that completely. We can say nothing about what the fundamental nature of reality really is.
This is really interesting, Tom. So I just want to encourage you. The way that you're talking about all these things, I think, is vastly different than the way that most atheists talk about these things. And I think that it would be good when you're introducing yourself to people to talk about these things, if you said something like, epistemically, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that there are any gods. I don't think there's any good arguments for gods. Ontologically, I'm an agnostic. I don't know whether there actually are any gods or are not any gods. I don't know. I think that a lot of philosophers, if you're going to dialogue with them, would understand that view a lot more, as we've been talking here for the last 45 minutes, to be a more accurate description of your own view. So I don't think that the divide between the noumenal and the phenomenal is nearly as stark as you think that it is. I think that we do have access to things about ultimate reality. I think that you're reasoning towards something like naturalistic pantheism, towards a necessary being. You are making an ontological claim there, that there needs to be some underlying ground. You're not just saying, for all I know. You're actually reasoning about the cosmos or the cause of the cosmos, and I think it's good reasoning. I think it's valid. I also think that when you reason that 2 + 2 = 4, that's a metaphysical, ontological claim. It's not just a, well, in this world, in the way that we see it, who knows if that's true or not. And I think the same way that you would want to reason about the laws of logic themselves and the existence of the law of non-contradiction, that you can't have contradictory states of affairs that obtain at the same place in the same time. Those are statements not just about the phenomenal realm. They're statements of truth that are universal, and they're seem to be unrestricted in the way. I don't want to say like, well, the law of non-contradiction, well, it's true in the actual world as I understand it phenomenologically, but who knows if it's true somewhere else. At least when I'm talking about the law of non-contradiction, I'm certainly not talking about it that way. Do you understand yourself to be talking about the law of non-contradiction and mathematical truths not as ontological realities, but merely from an epistemic perspective of phenomenology?
Correct. My position on math and logic is that reality exists and reality is the way reality is. And then we have created these languages of math and logic to describe the way reality is.
Okay, but even the statement
not prescriptive.
Even the statement that you just made is not a claim about your appearance. Reality is the way that reality is. That's a metaphysical claim.
Well, I would go with Descartes and say that I would reject the possibility of even like 1 + 1 = 2, because there could be an evil deceiver and I could be wrong even about that. So I wouldn't say that even those are necessarily metaphysical claims. Those are claims about the phenomena, about the world we experience.
Metaphysical claim. You're saying that it could be this other way. You're making a claim about modality. You're making a claim about what could be and what could not be. That is a metaphysical claim.
Right. I'm happy to say that metaphysics could be any way. The point that we can't make any claims about metaphysics is that we can't say it is one way, because it could always be any other way. And so my position about, you said the
well, you
necessary
don't think
thing.
It could be any way. You don't think that it could exist in a logically contradictory way. You don't think it could be the case that we are both talking and not talking at the same time, do you?
Oh, right. I say that logic is a description of the way reality is. So I don't think that reality can be not reality.
Do you think it's a true description of the way reality is? Or is it just a phenomenal? Is it a noumenal?
I consider those to be the same thing. The true isn't like a capital T true. It's just a phenomenal true. It's true insofar as we can tell, it's true to our minds or how our brains work. But I would not go so far as to say that logic is fundamental is metaphysical part of a reality. It's not. It's just a language. It's just a language. That's it.
Okay, so yeah, you probably feel the same way then about the laws of nature.
Correct. The laws of nature do change. Actually, we can actually show they do. So those aren't fundamental either.
Yeah. So I don't quite know how to proceed in the discussion if we're not on the same page about like the laws of logic, because I think the laws of logic aren't just restricted in a sense to govern our interactions or whatever. I think that they actually tell us stuff about the real world, and the real world that exists independently of your knowing about it or I knowing about it or any other conscious being knowing about it. I think the laws of logic are kind of baked into the reality of it all. So
I tend to go with most logicians and just say logic is a formal language. That's it. But that's slightly off. Not really. I wouldn't go with that as an argument to try against your position because we don't agree on that. So that would be a bad way for me to progress in the conversation.
sure.
So to go back to your points of, like, you brought up.
So yeah, let's go back to the intuition stuff. That's a little more helpful here. Do you think that there are any reasonable ways of talking about greater than or less than in terms of beings? Do you think it makes sense at all to say that a human being is greater than a rock?
No, I don't think it's like, it would be like saying a human being is prettier than a rock. I mean, it's just purely subjective interpretation. There's no, it doesn't correspond to anything existing in reality.
I mean, I don't buy into a subjective theory of beauty. So like, it does make sense to me to say that human beings are prettier than rocks. I mean, especially like my wife, she's way prettier than all the rocks. Trust me.
Well, could you give me an example of something you would consider more arbitrary?
Yeah, no, I'm just being playful. I appreciate the point of what your response is. So what about things that are at least maybe not intrinsically valuable, but they're valuable insofar as they lead to some end, right? So Dirk Nowitzki, Hall of Fame basketball player, played his last home game last night at American Airlines Stadium here in Dallas. He's a tall guy. I think he's 6'10", 6'11", right? Being tall certainly lends itself to being a better basketball player. Not to say that if you're short, you can't be a good basketball player, but just, on the aggregate, the average height of an NBA player is significantly taller than the average height of an American male, right? So in some sense, it makes sense to say that being taller is superior property if towards the end of being an NBA player, right?
Sure.
Okay. So we're not on different pages about whether or not it makes sense at all to talk about superior or not. Where we might not agree is on like intrinsic value, because what I just discussed was something that we're not talking about the intrinsic value of height. We're talking about instrumental value. But I don't know. We're probably not going to agree on a lot of the axiology here, or the ethical claims, or norms of beauty, or any of these, and that's okay. I mean, it's okay that we disagree, but it does seem to me that there are certain things that are intrinsically good. They're good not just instrumentally, but it's just part of what's baked into it. So I think existence is a good thing. I think existence is superior to non-existence. Is that something that you disagree with?
Yeah, I wouldn't apply intrinsic value to existence or non-existence. I think it would be essentially up to the person.
You wouldn't apply a what value?
Intrinsic value to existence versus non-existence. I would put it more like being tall as being good for basketball. It's good to exist if you want to exist. It's not so good to exist if you don't want to exist.
Well, what about things that don't have wants, like trees or rocks?
Yeah, I wouldn't consider them existing or not existing being the better or worse for the tree or the rock.
Well, I'm not talking about for the tree or the rock. I'm just talking about this. By making it about for the tree or for the rock, you're baking in subjectivity to it. I'm trying to avoid that. I'm saying that existence is the kind of property that makes possible all these other good things in an instrumentally important way. So if you're already on board with saying that certain properties can be greater or less than based on not based on intrinsic things, but based on instrumental things, then existence is the kind of property that gives rise, because you cannot have any of the other good things. You cannot be a good basketball player unless you exist, right?
Right.
So existence seems to be the kind of property that we would say is good for the kinds of instrumental reasons that you've antecedently said, yeah, I'm on board with this much.
Right. I would agree that existing is instrumentally good for other instrumentally good things, but I wouldn't say it's intrinsically good.
Okay, that's fine. I think you can still have a successful modal ontological argument with that.
So to go back to the modal ontological argument, I would still say that maximally great is an arbitrary term, and we could just make up a different definition of maximally great. And if you wanted to show that this actually indicated what you're using to define the term to mean, you would have to show that the alternative definitions are not what reality actually agrees with. So like a reality could adopt the what's his name? Gasking's definition of that the greatest possible being is one that can create the universe without existing. Maybe that's the one reality actually likes the best, as opposed to your.
But that's a contradiction.
Well, that doesn't make a difference to the argument because it's just a reductio. The point is just
an argument cannot be a successful reductio if there is a contradiction in the argument before you actually get to the reductio. Okay, the only way that you can have a successful argument is that the reductio itself finishes with the non-existent. And no one is going to agree that a maximally great being is one that does not exist.
Oh, right. I'm totally agreeing with you. I'm showing that using your logic of saying if a maximally great being exists, and we can use this structure of the argument to indicate a logical contradiction. The problem isn't with the logical contradiction. The problem is with the structure of the argument.
Very good. So I'm gonna not talk about maximal greatness then anymore. I'm gonna use the premise that you gave. You agreed possibly God exists.
Right, and I would say possibly is also one of those imaginary things. Like possibility, either something exists or it doesn't exist. Those are the only options. Possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. Does it exist or doesn't exist? We don't know.
No,
so possibility from my position.
And now you're contradicting stuff that you said earlier, right? With the whole way where we spent time talking about the framework of the metaphysics of modality and possible worlds and the approach to this. Now what you're saying is you're not in agreement with that.
How so?
Because you're now saying that possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. No. Possibility means there is a possible world that's free of any logical contradiction. That's what possibility means. So I'm going to ask, because there's two contradictory claims being made here. On the one hand, standard modal metaphysics, to say that something is possible is not a measure of ignorance or whatever. It's to say that there is a state of affairs that's free of any logical contradiction. That's one option. Another option is to say that possibility is just a measure of human ignorance. One is an ontological claim that you said you were on board with. Now you're making an epistemic claim. They're not the same thing. So I need to know which one it is.
All right. So I don't really understand the difference necessarily between those two. Like from my perspective, when you say a possibility is a world that doesn't have any logical contradictions, that means it's a possible thing we could imagine being the case.
No, not quite. I think we would want to say that a possible world means that there is a state of affairs, okay? And whether or not the state of affairs is actualized or not actualized is not the question that we're interested in right now. That's the debate between the modal concretists and the modal realists. We're interested in just what is that state of affairs that's possible. And to say that it's possible means ontologically that there are no logical contradictions in it. To say it's a measure of human ignorance or something like that is to make an epistemic claim that for all we know, there's no logical contradiction, but maybe there is one that we haven't discovered yet. Okay, I'm stipulating X hypothesized by definition, right? A possible world, if it is genuinely possible, does not have any logical contradictions, whether we know about them or not. Okay? If there's a known logical contradiction, then obviously it's not a possible world. If there's an unknown logical contradiction, it's also not a possible world. In order to qualify as a possible world, there cannot be any logical contradictions in it.
All
That's
right, right. I think I see where we're going past each other on this. So when I'm saying it's possible, like the measure of human ignorance, I'm talking about the concretist versus the modal realist kind of distinction. I'm saying that yes, that would fit the definition of a possible world in a modal realist sense, but that world isn't actual. So I'm arguing that
how
yes.
can you know that? How can that is a metaphysical claim that you're
Right,
making.
right. So let me amend that. I'd say we have no reason to believe that world is actual as opposed to any other possible world.
Very good. I'm on board with you there. I am on board with you that we don't have any reason to know whether that world has been actualized or not.
Right. So I'm arguing that
with issues.
so it's possible that there is a world with. You said you didn't want to use maximally great being, but so it's possible there's a world where there's a maximally great being.
No,
But that world could be one of the non-actualized
not
worlds.
using terms maximal great. All I'm saying is there's a possible world where God exists.
Okay, so I would say that the possible world that God exists may not be the actual world.
Well, no, if there's a possible world where God exists, then part of what it means to be God is that you would exist at all possible worlds. And the actual world is a possible world. We know that because here we are, right? So if there is a world, even one world, a possible world where God exists, that's something that you have conceded, then if that one world, it doesn't have to be an actual world, it can just be a possible world. God exists in that world. Well, if God exists in that world, then a God who's properly God would exist in all worlds. Therefore, God exists in this world.
Right. Happy to grant all of that. So I'm just going to go in and change.
Right.
Right. Right. So I agree with all of that, but I can show that doesn't work because I can just change the definition of God from like a theistic God to a deistic God or a polytheistic God or a pantheistic God, the naturalistic pantheism.
Well, hang
I
on.
can change the definition of God to mean.
That's not quite right. I want to go back to something that I said, and unfortunately, I'm going to need to go here in 5 or 10 minutes. I want to go back to something that I said at the very beginning, which is that these kinds of natural theological projects, it's not clear to me that they get you to the God of the Bible, right? I believe in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And I believe in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. I believe Genesis 1 and John 1. The God that the biblical authors are talking about, I think Yahweh exists. And I just so happen to believe that the God of the philosophers is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? Convenient for me, right? But I'm not trying to say that there's any particular definition about God that's here. So the maneuver of playing this game of 3-card Monty, where you're wanting to shuffle things around, doesn't absolve the idea that if possibly God exists, then God exists. If you're on board with leading theorists in modal metaphysics. Now, what that God is, what is the divine nature? Well, that's a whole secondary question, but it's not the same thing as whether or not God exists.
Well, I'm happy to grant it if you're just using it in the vague way where God can mean essentially anything. And then I would just use what I followed up with what you said with I said it could just be naturalistic pantheism and a necessary, eternal, all-powerful nature without consciousness. And if you want to call that a God, I'm happy to grant that and say, yep, I'll grant the ontological argument works equally as well for pantheism as it does for theism.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure that that's right. But there are some people working in contemporary analytic philosophy of religion who are developing what they call non-personal views of God. Excuse me. Like Peter Forrest works on this. Andrei Bukharev also has alternative understandings of God. So they don't all have to look like the versions of theism that you're rejecting. But those aren't the views of God that I have. But I think a lot of times, especially when Christians are engaged in these discussions, they kind of think that the right way to view these kinds of conversations is that a successful conversation with somebody is one in which at the end of the discussion somebody says, yes, I believe that Jesus rose from the dead and that he died for my sins, right? Which that's what I want for you, Tom. I'd love for you to believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and be saved, right? But I think it's a long process. When you're starting with somebody like you who's an agnostic about the ontological claims and atheistic about the epistemic issues, right? So maybe like a good first step would be to say, actually, there are some good arguments for God out there. What that God looks like, well, that's a second question. So if the modal ontological argument gets you a God, then the question is, what is that God like? That's not the same thing as saying there are no gods. And whether or not we can know what the divine nature is, there's a long literature on that, right? And maybe this is where the noumenal phenomenal realm. I mean, even Thomas Aquinas, right? He was Mr. Christian philosopher dude. He thought that, and he was not a defender of ontological arguments, but he didn't know about modal ontological arguments and developments that happened in the 20th century. Maybe he would be now. I don't know. But he thought that like reason and philosophy could show you that God exists, but they wouldn't tell you anything about that God. They could just only tell you that there is a God. What is that God like? Well, he thought you needed the assistance of special revelation in order to get that. You wouldn't be able to derive that just from reason and whatever. Maybe because of some of the concerns that you have about how different people's intuitions are going to shape their thinking in one way or another. But even coming that far is a big leap, because it doesn't seem like you can now say that you're epistemically an atheist, because you think that the modal ontological argument is a valid argument for God. Which God? What is that God like? I don't know. But
just to clarify that a little bit, when I say God, I usually have the idea that there is consciousness as a necessary aspect of what most people define as a God. So if I can remove that aspect, it would no longer qualify by what most people would call God. So if you want to call pantheism and just eternal powerful nature with no consciousness a God, then I'm with you. I'm happy to grant that. Yep, that works too. But the whole point of my argument is that if every one of the arguments work equally as well for pantheism as they do for theism, then it doesn't show one of these over the other, and we can't conclude none of them actually indicate the theistic kind of God.
I understand the move that you're making, and just to be clear, I think consciousness is part of what a divine being would be. So if you lack that consciousness, on my view, it doesn't make sense to call that being God. So I grant the point. Nonetheless, there are people who are doing a lot of work. I mean, famously, Benedict Spinoza kind of adopts the sort of view that you're working with. And that kind of pantheism actually generates an incredibly successful ontological argument. It just goes like this: something exists, therefore God, right? What that God is, God is equivalent to the universe, or God is some transcendent being who is the cause of the universe, but unconscious. I don't know. That's not my views on these matters, for independent reasons, like we talked about, even on the Kalam argument. But as long as we're just gonna, because there's two things here that I want to make, and then we'll wrap it up. One is just that if you're going to define into the nature of God things that I would agree with, but there are people who disagree with, then you run the risk of begging the question against naysayers who want to adopt non-personal conceptions of God. And it seems to me that the best way to do that is just to say, I'm not making claims about all gods. I'm just making a claim about this one kind of God. So you're not actually an atheist. You're not saying that there are no gods or that there are no good arguments for any gods. You're saying there are no good arguments for these kinds of gods, and who knows about these lesser kinds of beings. Now, in our cultural situation where pretty much everybody agrees that God would be an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving being, I think that what you're doing is rational and makes sense. But don't mistake that in your own mind for saying, haha, there are no gods, because there's a lot of room still available in the logical space of what might count as a definition of a God or a maximally great being or something like that. So there's one thing.
Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. I just want to say you're totally right about that. I mean, I would just go with I think, therefore I am. Maybe I'm a god, therefore there's evidence of a god, or something like that. So there could be. You're absolutely right that if we use a broader definition of God, there could absolutely be evidence, and then my position of atheism would not hold in that context. But I'm also just applying this specifically to the Christian idea or the conscious idea of a god as just a fundamental part of the definition.
Yeah,
In
but even there, it's still possible, right? Like the modal ontological argument. You know, if on the end of it you're wanting to say, well, yeah, sure, but it could also be that there's this other thing. Okay, fine. So it could be that there's this naturalistic pantheism, but it could still also be that it is a conscious creator of the universe, right? And as long as you have the possibility of that conscious creator of the universe, then the argument follows, and that being actually exists of necessity. So you're going to need to do some more work on explaining either where the logic is invalid, right? And there have been plenty of people who've objected to modal ontological arguments. I think I've got responses to them. We didn't go that route. Some of the other stuff that I've done, even in recent interviews, talked about that and difference between positive existentials and negative existentials for modal appearance claims and things like that. But you're the one who granted the premise, right? That possibly God exists, right? Or that there's at least no logical contradiction there.
Yeah,
So
you're absolutely right. So I do have a response to that and indicate why this doesn't work. But that would be I don't want to keep you too long if you have to
yeah,
go.
sure. And you know, we like we discussed, and there's other issues that are looming out there, like, well, what do we do with problem of evil, problem of suffering, things like that. So the other thing I wanted to just press you on gently, because it's not clear to me how you respond to this, given the distinction between noumenal and phenomenal and kind of Kantian skepticism that you have. When we look at the account of the cause of the universe or something like that, or what the possible outcome of modal ontological arguments are, and you want to say, well, it could be this thing called naturalistic pantheism, or it could also be God, right? It seems like that claim itself is a metaphysical claim and not an epistemic claim. So when we're saying, like, it could be this or it could be that, we're talking about possibility. And because we're talking about possibility, we're doing the metaphysics of modality. And it doesn't seem to me that what we're doing there is merely epistemology. We are saying we are rationally justified in believing that there are certain things about the world. And we know it's either this or it's that. And those don't seem to be claims that are made about the phenomenal realm. They seem to be claims that are made about objective reality. Am I wrong in seeing you reasoning that way towards those ends?
You're absolutely correct. That is actually the response about my previous statement is the same response I would have to this, which is the principle of explosion. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's from falsehood, anything follows.
Yes.
So I would say that if you're using an argument that has some kind of falsehood in it that indicates theism, I'm just going to be able to turn that around and use it for pantheism. So
Sure.
the fact that I can use the argument for both, I'm trying to use as a grounding as a first step to demonstrate why this indicates nothing. Because it can work for both of these, it's really just a principle of explosion. It's a false argument. It doesn't indicate anything at all. Because I'm not a pantheist. I'm not saying that pantheism is a reasonable conclusion here. I'm just using your own logic to show that it can indicate a mutually exclusive alternative as the first step to try and lead to the conclusion it's a false argument.
So maybe I've miscommunicated here. I don't want to grant that it's possible that there's this naturalistic pantheism. It's not at all clear to me that something like that could generate the universe. It seems to me, from the way that I'm reasoning about these things, that there would have to be the act of a will in order to generate the creation of the universe. And our excursus into time never really touched on, to my mind, how it could be that the universe began to exist, whenever it is that the universe began to exist, at some arbitrary moment. Whatever that arbitrary moment is, couldn't have been eternally long ago, right? Because the universe began to exist. But if there was no act of will in bringing about the creation of the universe, then it would have been eternally long ago, because all of the necessary and sufficient conditions would have obtained to generate the universe from some unconscious, all-powerful, naturalistic, pantheistic, whatever thing that is the cause of the universe. But that's not the case, right? The universe did begin to exist. And so what accounts for that? Well, it seems to me that it must have been an act of a will. And the only kinds of things that have wills, that make decisions, are conscious things, or as best I know. Maybe there are other things that have a will that are unconscious, but I don't have any phenomenal experience of those kinds of beings. And inference to the best explanation would lead me to think, apart from any evidence of those kinds of beings, it's probably rational for me to conclude that those kinds of beings don't exist. Or at least to say I don't have any evidence of those kinds of beings existing. I do have evidence of these other kinds of beings existing, so I'm just going to kind of go with that until I have a reason to think otherwise.
I'm happy to grant that. Will and consciousness are essentially synonymous. I'm happy to grant that. So my response would be is that the reason God used his will to create the universe at some particular time is determined by his nature. There's something in his nature independent of his will that determines his will to do this. And I can just get rid of the will and say there's something in pantheism's nature which determines it to do this at a particular time, just like there's something in God's nature which determines him to do this at some particular time.
So, but now there's a contradiction in terms here, right? The pantheism stuff, because on pantheism, like, God is identical with the totality of the universe, and God is everywhere, right? But what we're saying is that this stuff used to not exist. And now you're saying that there must have been something that preceded the existence of that thing. Well, that's God. And whether or not that being is conscious or unconscious, and that's the stuff I'm trying to point you to. Go look at Peter Forrest or Andrei Bukharev or other people who are wanting to develop, or Spinoza himself, right? Non-personal conceptions of the divine. That's not my view of things, and I think that you're going to run into problems, even some of them that we've been discussing here. But that's not the same thing as saying there are no gods, right?
Right, I'm happy to grant that. If you want to say that a non-personal thing qualifies as a god, then I can grant that. I'm okay with that.
Because you have to talk about something that is not the universe, that is not part of the universe, that is responsible for the universe. Now, on naturalism, the only stuff that exists is the universe. But you would have to postulate something that is supernatural, something that is not part of the natural universe.
No, that's what I'm rejecting. So there's our universe. Our universe had a beginning, and only our universe. Only the space and time and matter that can be measurable in general and special relativity.
Right. What accounts for the beginning of that universe?
More natural stuff.
No,
that's what I'm saying.
I mean, we don't have any evidence for that.
Correct. We don't have any evidence for God. Those are on equal footing.
No, I've given you quite a bit of evidence for God.
Right, and I can match that one for one and show it works for the pantheism equally as well as it does for theism.
That's still a God.
Well, I'm happy to grant that. I'm happy to grant. So it doesn't. So if you wanted me to be more particular,
at this point, what you need to say is this: we have evidence that it's either God 1 or God 2, but we have zero evidence for no gods.
I'm happy to grant that. We can say there's evidence for either an unconscious, non-personal God or a personal God, and I would say no evidence indicates one way or the other, and I'm happy to grant that.
Okay, but that's not the same thing as atheism. You even on either one of these, you have to say that there is something that accounts for this universe that is not part of this universe. It's supernatural. So you're not a naturalist. You're a supernaturalist.
Well, I think natural things can exist outside of the universe. So I wouldn't say it's supernatural.
So no, this is just an error of simple set theory. Whatever the largest scope of what there is, that is the universe, right? So this universe, and we want to talk about parallel universes and all this. This is why we need to make distinctions about universes versus possible worlds. But if you're wanting to say that this universe rests on something else that's more fundamental, right? Okay, then what does that rest on? And are you going to end up with turtles all the way down? And that's just very not satisfying. That's infinite regress. So we need something that's going to finally put a stop to that on pains of violating principle of sufficient reason, right? So God 1 or God 2, either one of those are options. But here's what's not an option. No God. Other natural stuff. Okay, where's that come from? Well, more natural stuff. That's very unsatisfying.
Right. So my response would be is that just like you believe that there is some property of a God that's necessary, eternal, all powerful, I can say those can be natural properties we just haven't discovered yet. They're not supernatural. They're just more natural, undiscovered stuff.
Well, in order to count as natural, they have to be part of the universe. They can't be transcending the universe. That's how we define natural versus supernatural. The stuff that's in the universe is the stuff that's natural. The stuff that's not in the universe, if there is any, that's what would count as supernatural. So for you to say that there is stuff that's not part of the universe, well, by definition, that's not natural.
Well, I think this is going back to where we don't really have a solid definition or distinction between natural and supernatural, because I'm going with the physics definitions here. In physics, the universe is our universe and only our universe. And as soon as you go behind the Big Bang, it's not our universe anymore. There's like the multiverse is not our universe, the cyclic universe is not our universe, string theory is not our universe. Our universe is just
and postulating all that stuff, that's just science of the gaps. Just like, oh, well, we think there's a scientific explanation for this, we just don't know what it is or whatever. Science of the gaps. Okay, if people want to do that, that's fine. I don't think it's rational any more than it is for God of the gaps stuff. If it's an inference to the best explanation, then that's fine. So, yeah.
So yeah, that's essentially what I'm doing. Is I'm taking the science of the gaps and just adding in the godlike properties of necessary, eternal, all powerful, and just calling them, well, these can be natural too. You don't need the supernatural stuff. So you're right. I'm doing the exact same thing as a god of the gaps here.
But oh, absolutely. It's terrible reasoning. But
yes, it is on both sides.
No, it's not, because I'm not doing God of the gaps. I'm not saying, well, we don't have any explanation of this, so it must be God. I'm saying universes began to exist. All things that begin to exist are caused to begin to exist. Therefore, the universe was caused to exist. What could account for that? Has to be a decision of the will. Why do we know that? Because there's nothing else that could obtain if it was necessary in sufficient conditions that would have happened infinitely long ago. The universe has not been around for an infinitely long period of time. We have good reasons for thinking this. It's not God of the gaps reasoning.
Well, again, my argument is that I can match everything you said one for a naturalist explanation and show it as equally as plausible under a naturalist.
No, it's not natural. It's not natural because there are things that are transcendent of the universe. That's not natural.
So again, I think we need to clear up the definition of natural and supernatural sometime. But I'm just mean as opposed to a conscious personal being, we can show a non-conscious, what I would call natural non-God thing could explain all of this.
So the only difference between these two beings is consciousness, right?
Yes. So it just has no mind.
So consciousness is the property that makes something supernatural. So you're a supernatural being because you're conscious and I'm conscious. So I'm supernatural. That's on your account that you've just given. The only difference between the two beings, one counts as supernatural and the other one doesn't, is the property of consciousness. Now you have just given so much power to every conscious being because they can now say, I'm a supernatural being. That's really interesting entailment of your view, but I don't think it's right.
Well, I think that consciousness, as we can understand it in material human beings, is a product of the brain. So if we're talking about a consciousness that is outside of the universe, that is not a product of material forces, then I would classify that as supernatural, and I don't think it has that. So those are two different things on my view.
Well, I understand. So you think consciousness is an emergent property too?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Well, this has been a fun discussion. I mean, your views are not at all what I thought that they would be since you introduced yourself as an atheist. But I've really enjoyed the discussion. So.
Yeah, me too. This is a great discussion. I love having these deep philosophical conversations.
Yeah, me too. It's fun to have them. And I hope that anybody who watches this enjoys it. So thanks for the invitation.
I really appreciate you coming on and talking with me.
Absolutely. If I ever make it up to Minneapolis, maybe I can talk you into going to a Twins game. So
absolutely.
Cool. Talk to you later.
See ya.
Bye.